April 8th, 1943. 27,000 feet over Rouen, France. The air here is so thin and cold that every breath through the oxygen mask carries a dry, metallic aftertaste. Outside, the temperature has plummeted below 40 degrees. Frost instantly covers the cockpit canopy if the heater is turned off for even a second, turning the world into an opaque white shroud that isolates the pilot in a silent, freezing void. Oberleutnant Rolf Hermann of the 2nd Fighter Wing, Richthofen, comfortably readjusts the control stick of his Bf 109. He can feel the fine vibration of the Daimler-Benz engine pulling him through the thin indigo sky. Hermann peers at the horizon, where new silhouettes have just appeared against the cold morning sun. These are not the familiar, nimble Spitfires with their elegant elliptical wings. This is something massive, bloated, and, frankly, ridiculous. In his headset, Hermann hears the voice of his wingman, who cannot suppress a chuckle through the static of the radio. The tone is dismissive and arrogant. "Ralph, look to the northwest. Our enemies have sent us flying milk bottles." Hermann smiles under his oxygen mask. Against the backdrop of sleek, razor-thin German fighters, the American P-47 Thunderbolts look like a technical misunderstanding. A bulky fuselage, an enormous nose, a complete absence of the aerodynamic aesthetics that European aces are used to. This is not a fighter. It's a soaring barrel that seems destined to fall through the sky under the weight of its own 7-ton mass before it can even engage in combat. German pilots, the elite of the Luftwaffe, veterans of the Spanish Civil War, the Polish campaign, and the lightning-fast blitzkrieg across France, were used to duels. They believed in speed and maneuverability. They believed a fighter should resemble a thoroughbred hound or a surgical scalpel, sharp, light, and clinical. Hermann's machine weighed 2.5 tons. The appearance of a 7-ton monster seemed to them a gesture of desperation on the part of the Americans. What Hermann did not know, and what none of the German aces circling now like wolves over the French sky could imagine, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would methodically and mercilessly destroy all Luftwaffe presence in Europe. They saw a clumsy target. In reality, they were looking at their own death warrant. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded into those broad, almost square wings. 8 heavy 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3,400 rounds of heavy lead on board, a combined rate of fire of 6,000 rounds per minute. It was not just a weapon. It was a mobile wall of lead. It was enough to literally saw any German aircraft in half in less than 2 seconds of sustained fire. No time to bail out. No chance of survival. Hermann's smirk will vanish in 6 months if he even lives that long. But today, in April 43, he still believes in the old rules. He believes that war is a contest of pilots, their individual courage and personal mastery. He has not yet realized that the world has changed irrevocably, and war is now a contest of industrial output, assembly lines, and logistics. And in that new contest, Nazi Germany did not have a single chance. The enormous hulk of the Thunderbolt was just the tip of an iceberg that was about to sink the Third Reich into the depths of history. To understand the scale of the underestimation of this machine, one must look at the P-47 through the cold eyes of the Luftwaffe's technical service in 1941. This was a period when German engineering was considered the unquestioned global standard. When the first blueprints and intelligence data on Republic Aviation's new machine landed on the desks of the Air Ministry in Berlin, the reaction was almost comical. Professional engineers looked at each other in disbelief. "The Americans have completely lost their minds," was the unspoken verdict. The German Messerschmitt 109 weighed about 2.5 tons. Even the heaviest German fighter of the time, the FW-190 Butcher, barely crossed the 4-ton mark when fully loaded. The American P-47 weighed 7 tons, empty. General Inspector of Fighter Aviation Adolf Galland, a legendary ace with a cigar perpetually between his teeth, reviewed the specifications and later wrote in his post-war memoirs, "We sincerely could not understand why anyone would build a fighter the size of a twin-engine bomber. It seemed to us the perfect sluggish target. In any turning dogfight, it was destined to lose everything. It was a big, fat target that was impossible to miss." Technically, they were right. If one viewed an aerial battle as a nightly duel on an open field, the Thunderbolt's turning radius was indeed a serious problem. At low altitudes, where the air is denser, it was inferior to German machines in acceleration. Its frontal profile was massive. It was easier to hit than any other single-engine aircraft of World War II. The German aviation school designed its engines for maximum compactness. Liquid cooling allowed for thin, elongated, and graceful engine cowlings. The Americans, however, took a different path. They took the Pratt & Whitney R2800, a massive 18-cylinder, double-row radial engine, outputting a staggering 2,000 horsepower. This was an engine worthy of a small ship or a heavy bomber. But to keep this monster running at 30,000 feet, where the main battles would take place, engineers squeezed a giant turbocharger into the fuselage. A system of ducting through which incandescent exhaust gases were driven to a turbine in the tail of the plane, occupied nearly half the internal volume of the aircraft. It was this architectural necessity that made the P-47 so fat. From the perspective of a German designer, it was an architectural disaster. It is not a plane, it is a flying dump truck that the Americans somehow forgot to sheathe in tank armor, were the jokes that echoed in the officer mess halls of the JG-26 Squadron on the Pas-de-Calais coast. But German analysts, intoxicated by their victories on the Eastern Front and over England, missed two factors that would eventually turn their smirks into a death rattle. The first factor was durability that defied human understanding. Because of its air-cooled system, the P-47 had no radiators with antifreeze. A single random bullet hitting a Messerschmitt's radiator meant certain death. The engine would seize 5 minutes after the fluid leaked out. A P-47 could fly home with an entire cylinder blown off, covered in oil, with a chunk of its tail missing, and 200 holes in its fuselage, and it would land, and the pilot would step out on his own 2 feet. The second factor was the dive. Thanks to its monstrous 7-ton mass, the Thunderbolt accelerated in a vertical descent to speeds that literally snapped the wings and jammed the control surfaces of any German pursuers. If a P-47 pilot felt danger, he simply pointed his nose at the ground. At that moment, he became the fastest object in the inhabited sky. No Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf could catch it in that vertical plunge. German aces suddenly discovered that their opponent could exit a fight at any moment, but they could not. But most importantly, the secret was not in the tactics, but in the mentality. The Luftwaffe prepared for duels of aces. In America, however, they prepared for a war of industrial machines. Hitler saw aviation as an elite knightly order. The United States saw it as an assembly line meat grinder. 1942. The atmosphere in Britain resembles a giant construction site. The United States has only just begun to transfer its main forces across the ocean, and this stream looks endless. Across the Channel, in occupied Europe, Nazi intelligence, the Abwehr, desperately counted the arrival of transports. As early as January 1942, President Roosevelt, in his address to Congress, demanded the unthinkable: production of 100,000 aircraft a year. German analysts studying these figures simply shook their heads. Hitler publicly called these numbers a publicity stunt to boost Yankee morale. In Berlin, they believed America was a country that only knew how to build civilian cars and refrigerators, and their industry was too pampered for the harsh conditions of total war. It was the greatest strategic blindness in history. The Republic Aviation Factory in Farmingdale, New York, became one of the altars of this new faith in mass production. Here, work did not stop for a single second. The 5-day work week was a thing of the past. 3 shifts of 8 hours each. Tens of thousands of women, the famous Rosie the Riveters, replaced the men who had gone to the front. They drove rivets into the steel sheets of the fuselage at a speed that German craftsmen considered fantastical. To help you understand the scale, one P-47 fighter cost $83,000 back then. Today, that is the equivalent of nearly 1.5 million. A total of 15,636 of these machines were built during the war. If you lined them all up in a single row, it would stretch for 150 kilometers. This was a budget capable of financing the economy of a mid-sized European country for decades. And this was just one type of aircraft out of dozens. But a plane coming off the assembly line in Long Island is not yet a weapon. It must be delivered to the front through the Atlantic, crawling with Admiral Donitz's U-boats. The logistical loop, which they preferred not to think about in Berlin, worked with the precision of a perfect clock. Every few days, massive convoys of Liberty ships left U.S. ports. On their decks, covered in tarpaulin, stood rows upon rows of Thunderbolts. By the spring of '43, so much aviation fuel, spare parts, and ammunition had been accumulated in England that American soldiers grimly joked, "Our island is only staying afloat because all this cargo is evenly distributed across the surface." In the Luftwaffe, the situation was exactly the opposite. Every lost, experienced pilot was a hole in the front that could not be filled. Every downed plane required Reich resources that were melting under the blows of strategic bombing. Training a single German ace took 18 months of intensive drills. Germany was running out of fuel, running out of steel, and most importantly, running out of time. For the United States, losing 10 or 20 P-47s in a morning was just a figure in a weekly statistical report. Factories replaced those losses in a matter of hours. A single Thunderbolt carried 3,400 rounds in its wings. In one standard mission by a group of 48 fighters, 160,000 rounds took to the air simultaneously. It was a flying wall of incandescent lead moving at 600 kilometers per hour. German pilots began to notice a terrifying change. They were seeing not individual heroes in their sights, but a cold, anonymous system of industrial destruction. This system knew no fatigue. It knew no fear. It just kept coming. In April '43, Hermann smirked at the milk bottles. He was taught that war was about valor. But he was not taught that valor is powerless against an assembly line. In June, he stopped smiling when he saw those bottles swallow his best unit in a single mission. In August '43, he first tasted cold, stagnant fear. It happened the moment one of those sluggish American machines withstood a direct hit from his 20mm cannon, simply shook it off, turned around with all its 7-ton weight, and erased his wingman from the history books with a single-shot half-second burst. The era of the Thunderbolt was beginning, an era when quantity became a new quality. To truly understand why the P-47 survived in situations where other aircraft turned into balls of fire, you have to look under its steel skin. This was not just a fighter in the classic sense. It was a triumphant victory of American industrial thermodynamics over European common sense. The heart of this monster was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 rows in a staggered pattern. When this behemoth started up on the parking apron, the entire airfield shook with a low, visceral roar that was impossible to confuse with anything else. It was the sound of raw, primitive power. But the secret of the Thunderbolt's superiority at high altitude lay not in the cylinders themselves. Nearly the entire rear compartment of the fuselage, from the pilot's cockpit to the very tail, was occupied by a colossal General Electric turbocharger. Republic aviation engineers ran massive steel pipes, each the diameter of a human torso, through the entire interior of the plane. Incandescent exhaust gases were driven from the nose to the tail, spinning a turbine at insane revolutions per minute. That turbine, in turn, drove compressed, supercooled air back to the engine. This incredibly complex closed-loop system allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain its full power of 2,000 horsepower at an altitude of 10,000 meters, right where German fighters began to suffocate from a lack of oxygen, becoming sluggish and unmaneuverable. A P-47 pilot at 10,000 meters felt just as confident as he did at ground level. But the main argument in any debate was the wings. Each wing of the P-47 carried 4 heavy machine guns of 12.7mm caliber, the legendary Browning M2. Total, 8 barrels. It was more than any other single-engine fighter of that war. German aces, such as Erich Hartmann or Gerhard Barkhorn, traditionally preferred cannons. In the Luftwaffe, it was believed that one lucky 30mm shell was better than 100 bullets. No, the Americans calculated otherwise. Their bet was on the density and volume of fire. The mathematics was merciless. A 5-second burst from 8 machine guns showered the target with over 100 kilograms of lead. You didn't need to be a sniper. You just needed to point the swarm in the direction of the enemy. Upon impact from such a mass of metal, any aircraft literally disintegrated. Inside the P-47 cockpit, it was provocatively spacious. American pilots, transferring from Spitfires, joked that you could go for a morning jog in there. Unlike the cramped Messerschmitt, where the pilot's elbows were pressed against the sides and the back of his head almost touched the canopy, there was room for ergonomics in the Thunderbolt. Armored glass, 38mm thick, protected the face. A massive steel seat back capable of withstanding a direct hit from a 13mm German bullet. At the pilot's disposal were perfect communications, heating, and even space for personal items. This was the material embodiment of the American doctrine, taking care of the person. If a plane costs $100,000 and pilot training costs twice as much, then saving on comfort and protection is simply bad business, and this doctrine worked. When the Thunderbolt entered a vertical dive, its mass, those same 7 tons of steel and aluminum, turned into unstoppable kinetic energy. It accelerated to an insane 880 kilometers per hour. German pilots watched with held breath as a huge gray shadow crashed down on them from above, and then, after a short flash of fire, just as swiftly escaped vertically into the sky, using the colossal inertia of its weight. The Germans nicknamed it Boom and zoom, strike and vanish. And there was practically nothing they could do to counter this tactic. Summer 43. The sky over Germany had turned into a giant slaughterhouse. American B-17 Flying Fortress strategic bombers were trying to break the back of Nazi industry, but they were paying a terrifying and bloody price. Without fighter cover, they were easy, though toothy, prey for Luftwaffe squadrons. The P-47 Thunderbolt became the first American fighter that could accompany the fortresses deep into enemy territory. No, there was one critical problem: flight range. An old saying went, "The Thunderbolt needs as much gasoline as the entire rest of the 8th Air Force." The Americans began to hurriedly hang extra fuel tanks under the belly of the P-47. German radars initially noted with relief groups of fighters that, by all calculations, were destined to turn back after 100 kilometers. But they did not turn. In August 43, during crushing raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, German dispatchers reported in a panic to headquarters. The Thunderbolts are still with them. They are over the territory of the Reich. This is impossible. For the Luftwaffe leadership, this was a technical knockout. Their entire defensive doctrine crumbled into dust. It was in these grueling battles that German aces realized their vaunted advantage in horizontal maneuverability was useless against coordinated American groups. The finger four tactics introduced by the Americans left no chance for lone wolves. While one Messerschmitt tried to drag one P-47 into a turn, a second American would come from above at huge speed and turn the German into a sieve with a short burst. Statistics of losses began to change rapidly against the Reich. In June 43, the 56th Fighter Group claimed 16 enemies, shot down with the loss of only 2 of their own machines, 8-1. This was the beginning of the end for the era of Luftwaffe dominance. Robert Johnson, one of the greatest Thunderbolt aces, became a living legend of this machine's survivability. In one battle, his plane fell under the fire of Luftwaffe master Egon Meyer. The Focke-Wulf's cannons literally shredded Johnson's P-47. He had no ammo left, the hydraulics failed, and thick black smoke poured from the engine. Meyer approached point blank and fired the rest of his ammunition into him until his cannons went silent. Johnson survived. Meyer rocked his wings, paying tribute to the survivability of this barrel, and flew away. Johnson made it back to the coast of England. After inspection, the mechanics were horrified. They counted 21 direct hits from 20mm shells and over 200 holes from machine guns in the plane. Any other aircraft of the time, a Mustang, a Spitfire, or a Messerschmitt, was guaranteed to fall apart in midair or burn up. The P-47 simply carried its man home, refusing to die. The Luftwaffe was losing its last veterans, and America continued to send new and new guys, trained on the most modern industrial principle. By the end of 43, the sky over Germany had ceased to belong to the Germans, even over their own cities. While industrial thunder rolled in Europe, the P-47 was proving its phenomenal versatility on the other side of the globe. The islands of the Pacific Ocean, the impenetrable jungles of New Guinea, heat of 40 degrees, 100% humidity, and coral sand that clogs mechanisms and kills engines faster than enemy bullets. Here, the main opponent was the Japanese Zero fighter. Light as paper, incredibly agile, they were dangerous in close combat. Japanese pilots, out of old habit, tried to drag the Americans into a carousel of turns. But those who flew the Thunderbolt quickly learned the golden rule: never try to outmaneuver a Japanese plane. The tactic remained the same, dictated by mass: dive, cover with a storm of fire, escape like a candle going up. The thin skin of Japanese machines, lacking self-sealing tanks, burst into flames like a haystack from the slightest hit by Browning incendiary bullets. The heavy P-47 became an unquestionable nightmare for the Japanese. It was almost impossible to shoot down with their light cannons, while it destroyed any Japanese aircraft with a single touch. A special little-known page is Soviet Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union received 195 P-47D fighters. Most were delivered via the Iranian corridor. Soviet pilots, used to the small, austere, and incredibly light Yaks and Lavochkins, initially looked at the American giant with undisguised skepticism. Too huge, too complex, requires too high-quality gasoline were the first reviews. But when they appreciated the level of comfort, the reliability of the radio communications, and most importantly, the fantastic survivability, their attitude changed to the exact opposite. For the Soviet Air Force, the P-47 became the ideal high-altitude air defense interceptor. There, at 10,000 meters, where German Junkers, Ju-88 scouts, felt completely safe from Soviet fighters. The Thunderbolt caught them effortlessly thanks to its giant turbocharger impeller. By 44, P-47 Thunderbolts were flying under the flags of the US, Great Britain, Free France, the USSR, Brazil, and even Mexico. It was a truly global network of industrial retribution. The total flight time of all Thunderbolts during the war exceeded 1.5 million hours of intensive combat operation. The creator of this aircraft, the brilliant immigrant from Georgia Alexander Kartveli, once remarked to a circle of friends, "We never built it for beauty or graceful lines. We built it as a tool that is obliged to return a person home, no matter the cost." By the middle of the global slaughter, it was finally clear. The era of nightly duels in the clouds had ended forever. The time of total industrial suppression had arrived, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was the weightiest, in the literal sense of the word, argument for this new reality. June 6, 1944, Normandy, the most massive amphibious operation in human history. Those who were on board the ships that night recalled that the roar of aircraft in the sky was so dense that it felt like a physical mass pressing down on the water. No, the real work for the P-47 Thunderbolt began when the first Allied soldiers secured themselves on the bloody beaches of Omaha and Utah. By this point, the Thunderbolt had finally ceased to be just an escort fighter. It had turned into a Jabo, jagged bomber, a fighter bomber. The German infantry soon began to pronounce this word with the same horror they once felt for the word Stalingrad. Under the powerful wings of the P-47 now hung an arsenal worthy of a small battleship. 2 500-pound bombs under the wing consoles and one 1,000-pound special delivery under the fuselage, and between them HVAR, unguided rockets, nicknamed Holy Communion by those who fired them. In total, the combat load of a single Thunderbolt exceeded the capabilities of some medium bombers from the beginning of the war. This was the birth of the armed reconnaissance concept. Groups of 8 or 12 aircraft bar-roomed over the French fields, with orders to destroy anything moving east or west. The German troops in Normandy, day turned into a time of deadly silence. To go out on the road during daylight hours meant signing your own death warrant. German tankers recounted that the sound of the R-2800 engine overhead caused an immediate urge to abandon the vehicle and run into the nearest ditch. The 12.7mm machine guns that the Americans were so proud of turned into an instrument of instant disintegration during low-level strafing runs. A burst pierced locomotive boilers, causing steam explosions, crumpled truck armor like tin foil, and set fuel tankers ablaze. The logistics of Nazi Germany in France were not just disrupted, they were erased from the face of the earth in a matter of weeks. Gun camera footage from those years shows a single Thunderbolt diving on a bridge or a railway train. A moment, and hundreds of tons of steel turn into a pile of scrap metal. The enemy no longer laughed at the flying milk bottles. They hid from them in the forests, under camouflage nets, realizing that the industrial beast of America had come for each of them personally. Flying at the height of the treetops was the most dangerous and thankless job in the entire war. Anti-aircraft fire of all calibers, from a rifle bullet to 88 millimeters, constantly accompanied the Thunderbolts over the target. During the entire Second World War, the United States lost 3,043 P-47 fighters directly in combat. This might seem like a huge figure, but here again, it is worth remembering that same mathematics of the sentence. Out of the 15,636 machines built, irrevocable losses amounted to less than 20%. At the same time, the Thunderbolt performed more than 545,000 combat sorties. Credited to these machines are nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft shot down in the air and hundreds of thousands of destroyed tanks, guns, and vehicles on the ground. For every one Thunderbolt shot down, an average of 4 Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed. This was an industrial coefficient that could not be beaten by any amount of valor. But the most important statistical indicator was not the enemy's death, but the life of one's own. Thanks to its incredible strength, the P-47 had a staggering pilot survival rate. If a Mustang or a Spitfire, after a hit to the cooling system, fell like a stone behind the front line, the P-47 often returned on a wing and a prayer. Documented in hundreds of cases are instances where a Thunderbolt arrived back at the airbase with a chunk of its wing torn off, covered in hot oil from punctured cylinders, with its tail sheared, and the pilot landed it on the grass, stepped out of the cockpit, and went to dinner. This gave American pilots a psychological advantage. They knew their machine would fight for their life until the very last bolt. December 44. Hitler's Ardennes offensive, his last, desperate gamble in this bloody game. 8 days of thick January fog hid the movement of Nazi divisions. During those days, the Germans believed that God was on their side. They advanced, believing that the industrial advantage of the Allies was neutralized by the weather. On December 23rd, the sky suddenly became crystal clear, and at that moment, the thunder truly struck. Thousands of P-47s took to the air from airfields in Belgium and France. They found German tank columns frozen on narrow, snowy roads. For the HVAR rockets, the top armor of German Tigers and Panthers was no defense. It was a strategic thrashing. German fuel reserves were blown up right in the tankers. Ammunition detonated in trains. By the middle of January 45, the Luftwaffe, as an organized force, had finally ceased to exist. Even their new jet, Me-262s, could not change the outcome. The Americans simply plowed their airfields with 500-pound bombs every 3 hours. After the surrender of Germany, American historians and intelligence officers conducted hundreds of interrogations of captured generals. The answers to the question about the reasons for defeat were surprisingly unanimous. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the father of German tank forces, stated with bitterness, "Any successful move we made on the ground was devalued the moment your fighter bombers appeared over the battlefield. We were fighting against an entire industry that knew no fatigue. Your aircraft became a wall that we could not break." German ace pilots in captivity spoke even more candidly. The famous Adolf Galland admitted, "The Mustang was a dangerous opponent in a duel, but the Thunderbolt caused a sense of sacred terror in us. When that iron mountain came at you head-on, firing from 8 barrels, it felt as if the sky itself was falling on you. And it was practically impossible to kill it. We saw our shells hitting it, and it just kept flying and killing." For German military thought, which relied on elitism and quality, the encounter with the soulless industrial giant in the form of the P-47 was a fatal shock. It was the realization that the era of individual heroism had ended. The era of the industrial automaton had arrived. May 45. The world exhaled after 6 years of madness. Thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts stood on the airfields of Europe. They had fulfilled their task. Slowly, on an assembly line principle, they began to be phased out of the Air Force, replaced by Sabre jet machines. The machine they laughed at in 43, calling it a flying milk bottle, ended the war as the most mass-produced fighter in the history of the United States. 15,636 units produced. Each of them was a rivet in the coffin of the Nazi Empire. Today, these steel giants are rare guests in the sky. They stand silent in museums in Ohio and Washington, glinting their polished aluminum. They are a monument to that time when the mathematics of production won the most important victory over the philosophy of war. In April 43, Ralph Herman believed a fighter was a scalpel. In captivity, he admitted his mistake. They were not bottles. It was time itself that rose against us in the image of steel and fire. And time was on the side of the Thunderbolt.